Sampling and sound design are powerful tools in the arsenal of digital music production. You've probably worked with sample packs or used splice before, but it's only a small part of the bigger picture. Once you start recording your own sounds and transforming them, an entirely new dimension of sonic possibilities opens up. In this video, I'll show you what that can look like in practice. Using one of my own production as an example, we'll talk about the initial concept, the recordings themselves, and how everything was processed and shaped inside the DAW. Everything you just heard in this production comes from recordings that were made within a single hour here at the HOFA Studios. Together with my colleague Toby, we searched in and around the studios for interesting sounds to sample. I processed them using Ableton's audio effects and shaped them into the track you just listened to. These are the recordings that ultimately made it into the project. For deep bassy sounds, I was looking for an object with a large resonating body. That's why we used the trash bins. You can hear the stomping on the bin as well as the lid being slammed shut. The second recording comes from a houseplant that Toby shook. The idea here was to later turn it into a shaker-like element. To create additional percussive elements, we hit stones together and dropped them onto each other. They have nice transients and can be used in a versatile way. Toby, being the talented pianist he is, played a piece of Bach prelude on the Steinway out of boredom. This wasn't planned, but the recordings ended up being perfect as a melodic bed for the track. The original plan was to sample the piano note by note and make them playable in the multisampler. These are how those sounds turned out. In addition, we recorded various tapping and plucking sounds on the piano, which are particularly interesting because of their woody character. Of course, you could just record samples without knowing where the track will end up. But if you start thinking about it before or during the drum recording, A. Which sounds do I need for drums, bass or the other elements? And B. What kind of character does the sound producing object have? Then your workflow becomes much more efficient. You focus only on the recordings you actually need, saving time and energy in the post-production. For the recordings on this project, I already had a rough idea of the final song. I wanted to keep the sound intentionally organic, and it should be clear that everything here was sampled. I'm also a big fan of drums in the style of burial, as well as two-step and garage rhythms, and that's exactly the direction I wanted to go with this track. The recording that forms the foundation for most of the instrumental production is the prelude played by Toby. To make it more usable musically, I first stretched it so that each chord of the arpeggio fits exactly into one bar. To give the arpeggio more rhythm, I used an LFO shaper to modulate the gain, creating a pumping effect. After tonal shaping, the signal goes into a filter delay with a ping-pong effect, creating strong movement across the stereo field. I then laid the melody on top of the sonic bed. It's also based on the piano, but here I programmed a separate MIDI track and sent it into the multisampler with the individual notes. Without any further processing, it sounds like this. The pitch bend is embedded directly into the MIDI track using MPE. Also, the notes have no release, and I deliberately added stutter, which creates that slightly glitchy feel. To emphasize the imperfections even more, I added some noise using erosion. An overdrive and an amp then add extra distortion and give the sound more character. After that, I resampled the melody and loaded it into a granulator. There, the sample is played backwards. I then resampled these reverse sounds, cut them up and placed them as accents around the melody. Are you interested in sound design, producing, mixing and mastering? With the HOFA Audio Diploma course in Audio Engineering and Music Production, you'll gain all the knowledge and hands-on experience you need to produce successfully. Find out more at HOFA-College.com. The last element, which comes from a note of the Steinway, is the bass. For this I took a pluck from a low string, loaded it into a sampler and looped it to create a consistent bass tone. Here, I again work with distortion using an amp and a pedal to shape the sound and add presence in the upper frequency range. An OTT and a high shelf boost further help to bring out these highs. At first, the bass sounded very extreme and almost distracting. But here comes the twist. It was never the intention to have this much high end in the bass permanently. I only added the extra high frequencies so I could later automate a low pass filter. Through this automation, a swooshing effect is created at the end of each bar. Now, let's turn our attention to the drums. As expected, the kick and snare set the tone here. Both come from the same recording. After we catch up the tonal samples of the Steinway, we also recorded various percussive sounds from the frame and body of the piano. I loaded the long sample containing all these recordings into Ableton Simpler, which has a very important feature. It automatically detects transients and slices the samples at those points. This way you can trigger the individual percussive hits using MIDI. What really stood out to me in this sample was its very woody, resonant character. I emphasized the tonal part a bit more with an EQ and then fine-tuned it using a frequency shifter. With the simple, custom-built transient shaper and a wave shaper, I further expanded the dynamics of the signal after the reverb. This makes the transients punchier while slightly pulling back the tail of the reverb. Saturation and multiband compression then add the necessary energy in the upper frequency range. Next, I duplicated the entire snare track and shifted it down by 3 kHz using a frequency shifter. Since the overtone series is logarithmic, but the frequency shifter works linearly, the harmonic relations are lost. This is exactly what creates that slightly metallic, inharmonic character. This layer helps the snare to cut through even more as the upper frequencies of the metallic sounds add extra definition. The kick also consists of 2 layers. The first layer, just like the snare, comes from the long sample of percussive tapping sounds. However, the MIDI track here triggers different parts of the sample. To get the necessary low end, I then worked with the drum bus, specifically using the boom function. This adds a resonant tail. Simply put, you can think of it like an envelope triggered by the signal gating a sine wave at the frequency I set. This creates an additional sublayer, giving the kick more foundation. These sub-frequencies are then further enhanced with a compression and EQ. At the same time, a filter with an envelope follow reduces the noise, keeping the focus clearly on the low end. Now that we have built the drum framework with the kick and snare, we're missing the filling and groovy sounds. For this, I designed 4 layers. Now, let's take a look at the processing steps that transform the recordings into these interesting sounds. Without any processing, the shaker doesn't really sound like a shaker at all. You can just hear Toby shaking the houseplant. The characteristic rhythm only emerges here through the LFO-controlled gain modulation. 2 types of filters, an OTT as well as overdrive and the frequency shifter, give the shaker its final polish and a tonal movement. For the rhythmic percussion, we go back to the tapping recordings on the Steinway. Here different parts of the sample are played, 16th notes combined with dotted 16th notes. The signal then goes through a notch in the low-pass filter, while a formant filter adds the characteristic tone. An autopan creates the movement across the stereo field. The OTT and EQ further shape the tonal character and give the sound more presence. To emphasize the transients and expand the dynamics, I use the drum bus, slow compressors, a gate and a wave shaper. For the Foley layers and the offbeat head, I applied similar processing steps as with the previous percussion sounds, so I won't go through them individually again. Here's how it sounds before and after. Apart from a few small sound effects, we have now covered all the elements. You've seen how a complex, vibrant track can evolve step by step from just a handful of simple recordings, purely through creative sampling and sound design. I hope you were able to take away not only a few useful tricks, but also a better understanding of the mindset behind the sound design and how to approach it creatively. If you're interested in more tutorials, workshops and multimedia learning content, feel free to check out HOFA-College.com and explore the opportunities to study audio engineering and music production at HOFA-College.